Hello again, and yet another in the series on World War II Special Duties units. And we come to a book which discusses one of the really prominent figures. A lot of TV documentaries produced about SOE in recent years, and there's been quite a few of them, and some of them have been really, really good. But one figure that is usually on them is Professor Foote, but the other figure which seems to be included, particularly if they're talking about F section, is Vera Atkins. And she always comes across as a typical English lady. And so when I read this book, which I read when it was first published a couple of years ago, A Life in Secrets, the story of Vera Atkins and the Lost Agents of SOE by Sarah Helms, I was fascinated to find out that far from being an English lady, she was actually Romanian. And she grew up in Bucharest. Her mother was English/South African, and she was educated by English nannies. So she was completely, had the appearance of an English gentlewoman. Excuse me. But a tremendously complex life. And the title of the book, A Life in Secrets, is very, very apt, because she really is, a riddle and wrapped in an enigma. So the early years in Romania, she was in contact with British intelligence, SIS. Names are given of the officers and so on. But jumping ahead, she comes over to London in the mid-30s with her mother, and she makes 3 trips back to Europe, 2 to Switzerland and 1 to Holland. The trips to Switzerland had never been explained. They were explained as skiing holidays, but they were rather long for someone who didn't really have access to much in the way of funds. But the trip to Holland was to effect the rescue of her cousin and his wife, who were from Romania, and they were both Jewish. Her name was Rosenberg. Vera Atkins was Jewish herself. And she went to Holland and negotiated with the Germans for their release and allowed them to leave the country. Now, what the quid pro quo of that was, nobody knows. But she was in contact with the Germans. So throughout the book, you start believing that she may have been a Nazi double agent. Then you start believing she may have been a Soviet agent. And then you don't know what to believe. It is all resolved towards the end. You find out really more or less the truth as far as it can ever be ascertained. But it's a puzzle all the way through. Even her sexuality, you people have different ideas about that. So terrific book. And Sarah Helms, who is an investigative reporter for the Sunday Times, has done a tremendous job writing it. So she joins SOE at the start of World War II, and she was sponsored by Major Humphreys, who was SIS and then in Section D and then into SOE. So again, the connection with SIS. She becomes the intelligence officer for F section, dealing with France, working to Major Maurice Buckmaster. Then there's a lot of detail and a lot of things go on. But one of the major things, and it's been the theme of several of the books that we've talked about, is the physician network run by Francis Suttill, codenamed Prosper. Now, they were rounded up by the Germans, and the reason they were rounded up was Henri Dericourt, the air movements officer, had betrayed them. But once they were in German hands, the Germans were able to play back their radios. to London in what they call a Funkspiel, a radio game. Now, this had been done in the Netherlands, where virtually the entire SOE network there was controlled by the Germans, by the Abwehr. And the SD, the security service of the SS, wanted to get in on the act in France, and they successfully did it with the physician network. So there were indications that the network was compromised, but these were ignored in London. And there is discussion about how much Vera Atkins knew, and she didn't rock the boat at all. And the reason for this, which is amazing, is because she was in a very vulnerable position. Maurice Buckmaster, her boss, knew that she was a Romanian citizen. Now, Romania was an ally of the Nazis, so she was an enemy alien working for one of the most secret organizations in the UK. So had this become known by the security people, she would have been sacked at the very least, possibly interned for the duration. And she was always concerned about her mother. So she didn't rock the boat. Okay, after D-Day, when France was liberated, she went over to Paris as the SOE's liaison because they'd given the agents a contact RV in the event of liberation in a hotel. And she hung on there waiting for various agents to turn up. By the time it was over, there were 12 missing female agents. She goes back to London. SOE is disbanded. And one of the missing female agents, Yvonne Rudelat, gets back to London, arrives at Euston Station. And because she holds RAF rank, she phones up the Air Ministry and they tell her to hang on. Miss Atkins will come and pick you up. And she did. And didn't really make much of a fuss, but kind of asked her what had happened. And she'd been in a concentration camp in Ravensbrück. And this rocked Vera Atkins because at that time it was not thought that any British personnel were put into the camps, and they were. So this determined Vera to find out what happened to the rest of the female agents who were missing. So she was very determined, and as I say, SOE didn't exist anymore, but she was sponsored, trip was paid for by SIS. She was working to Major Norman Mott, who was the kind of last link, and she was given an RAF rank and was allowed to travel. And she goes to Germany and starts visiting various places, camps, talks to prisoners. She liaises Angus Fife, who was working in SOE security, works alongside her. She works with the Crowcast people, the Central Register of War Crimes and Security Suspects, and with the Barksworth people, who were the SAS team who were looking for the people who had murdered or executed, or murdered because it was illegal. They were uniformed personnel who were executed, SAS personnel. So one of the problems was, because they had never, SOE had never admitted that they were sending female agents into occupied countries, they hadn't put the women on any of the lists that the Allies were looking out for these prisoners. There was millions of displaced people all over Europe. So one of the people she interviews is Hans Kiefer, who was one of the senior SD officers in Paris. And I mentioned him before. He specialised in kind of playing the good cop, and he was a very successful interrogator, former police officer. And she asked him quite frankly about traitors, and straight away he said, well, of course, Gilbert, which was the code name for Henri Derico. So he said you recalled him to question him. MI5 questioned him on recall to London. And he said he was long an agent of Karl Bummelberg. He had a code number. So that was nailed on, that he was a traitor. So he also talked about Prosper and the physician network. And either he was cagey, or more likely Vera Atkins limited her notes on what was said then. And she did dig up a lot of information. Now, Sarah Helm, in writing this book, amazingly retraced the footsteps of Vera Atkins and visited a lot of the same places, to the point where she actually locates, meets and interviews the wardress who was in charge of the female section of Fortsheim prison, where Noor Inayat Khan had been imprisoned. And she was actually well treated in this prison, but the wardress didn't think it was proper for a female to be incarcerated in a male prison. And she had her moved. And unfortunately, she was moved into the concentration camp system, ended up in Dachau, where she was executed. So she would probably have survived had she stayed in Fortsheim. So, and Sarah Helms found all this out, and an amazing amount of information. It's like a detective story, amazing, absolutely amazing. And then Vera Atkins came back with all this information, which you think, oh, this is great. She's found out what happened to the female agents. But she used it really to shield the reputation of F section rather than to shed light. And in fact, she blocked inquiries from the family members, like Charles Bushell, who was Violette Szarbo's father, was making, through his MP, making really heated inquiries about what had happened to his daughter, because as far as he was concerned, she was in first aid nursing yeomanry and had just disappeared. And Vera never told him what had happened. Then another part concerns what happened to Derico. It was pretty well known that he was a traitor, and the French put him on trial. Nicholas Boddington turns up, and this is another mystery, how he found out. The only implication is some official body told him that the court case was happening, because Vera Atkins was actually in Paris and didn't know anything about it. So he turned up in Paris and gave evidence to the effect that London knew all about his contact with the Germans, and he was kind of acting with their approval. So the French had to find him not guilty. And then when Vera Atkins found out about this, she basically said that Boddington had perjured himself, that this wasn't true at all. And she I don't think she talked to him again after the war. They were all in the Special Forces Club. So right to the end of her life, the mystery of Vera Atkins it just deepened. And trying to dig up from her papers, from her relatives, from the friends, from former agents and so on, Sarah Helm's done an amazing job. Definitely one of the most interesting books I've ever read. And it's a favourite of mine. If you're interested in SOE, there's a couple of books I really recommend. One of them is Between Silk and Cyanide, really good inside story. And this is another one. Some of the other books I've reviewed are first class, and every one of them I think deserves reading. But I've got a particularly soft spot for this book. And if you're not going to read anything else, read this, because it will want you to read some of the others as well.